besides measuring inequality, a useful thing to measure when it comes to analyzing public policies, especially in developing countries, is poverty measures, measuring poverty. Now, the way we define poverty here, poverty is the possession of fewer resources than are necessary to attain a certain standard of living, an acceptable standard. Now, if you ask across the social sciences people what is their definition of poverty, everyone will come up with a different one. So there is no one definition of poverty. And obviously, and even if we can agree on this definition up here, where we would disagree is, and where anyone would disagree is probably over what constitutes an acceptable living standard. So defining what poverty is inevitably quite subjective. The way it works is we draw a line and say this is the income that's needed for an acceptable standard of. You can look at the World Bank or the UN website, what they currently have as the poverty line. Typically something like an income of $2 a day, which in poorer countries may be just about enough to have, would we consider this an acceptable standard of living? That is very much up for debate, but it's considered at least, you can survive on that. Whereas below that, it's very hard. And so that is then taken as the poverty line, and we then measure poverty relative to that line. And the poverty line can be either absolute, which is the example of a certain amount of income per day or per month. That's an absolute amount. Or it can be relative, which is what you have a lot in Europe, which is that we consider everyone as poor who has less than 60% of the median income or 60% of the mean income or something. Right, so that's the idea of absolute and relative poverty. Now, as with inequality indices, for poverty measures or poverty indices, we would also like to have we would like to find some properties that a useful poverty index should at the least have. Now, what should those be? Well, they should be definitely when poor households become worse off, that it should increase. Right? Then when you have a regressive transfer among the poor, so from those among the poor who are richer, give something to the, apologies, regressive here means you take something away from poorest and give it to the slightly less poor people, that index would also increase, okay? Because you make the poorest even worse off. And it should be at the same time insensitive to transfers among the people above the poverty, as long as the transfer doesn't push. And some poverty measures that we even see reported by the likes of the World Bank, the UN, fulfill that and others don't. So for example, one index that you can see a lot is just the poverty rate, is the share of people who are below the poverty line, and that would not fulfill that first property, because if the poor households get worse off, so they have even a lower income, the share of poor households doesn't change, that poverty index does. That poverty index only changes at the extensive margin if more people fall below that line. That doesn't mean it's useless. It just doesn't fulfill those principles, and for it doesn't tell us as much about poverty as we would probably want to know from an index. So the way we construct poverty indices is as follows. We fix the poverty line at Z, which again is either an absolute income or an income relative to some benchmark. And we have a discrete income distribution, and we have J households that are below the poverty line, and then N minus J households who are actually above the poverty line. And another important statistic that we generate for every household is the so-called income gap, which tells us, well, how far away from the poverty line is that household. And so the first measure is one I already mentioned and is often referred to as the headcount ratio, which simply tells us the proportion of people in a society that are below the poverty line, or the proportion of households. So that's called the headcount ratio. And the good thing about it is it's very simple, but it doesn't tell you anything about the depth of poverty. So how poor are those people really? If you have, let's say, a poverty line at 2/3 of the median income, and everyone who's below that gets, just a tiny bit less than 2/3 of the median income, that is different from everyone who's below the poverty threshold getting 0. That they would really be poor and begging and starving and whatever. That the headcount ratio doesn't tell you anything about that. It just tells you for every person, a 0, 1 is the person below or above that line. And if they're below, they're counted in that share. That is then the headcount ratio. So that's why you would see in publications that are a little bit, go a little bit deeper, typically also reports by the UN and its various agencies, the World Bank and so on, you would see also a publication of the income gap ratio. So the income gap ratio is between 0 and 1, and it tells us for all the poor people, so for all J poor people, you take for each of them their income gap and put that in relation to the poverty threshold. And then you take the average of that across all the J people, right? So one person is very close to the poverty line, so their income may be 90% of the poverty line. Another person may be very far away from the poverty line, and then you simply add this up over all the people and take the average, over all the poor people and take the average. So that has a huge advantage, right? Because if you have people that are so you can see this here. If everyone is very close to the poverty line, so the gap here is very small. You have an index that is close to 0. If everyone is far away from the poverty line, so at an income of 0, we would end up with an index of 1. Right? So the higher the index, the greater is the level of poverty, and the greater is the depth of poverty, not how many people. This is an index that operates on the intensive margin, how poor. And so obviously what it ignores here is that the differences, it ignores the inequality within, among the poor households. It just gives every household that's poor equal weight. Right? But you can, you can obviously construct even more sophisticated indices. But if you have an index that is so sophisticated that no one can interpret changes in it, then that doesn't make sense either. So what you typically see is variations of that index. You see a Gini index and you see a headcount ratio. These are the 3 measures of poverty and respectively inequality that are typically measured in reports. Right? And you can see this here. So you have here the poverty gap. So that's the income gap ratio. And for that, you have the scale on the right. And so for Ireland, that is around 20. So on average, the poor people are about 20% percentage points away from the threshold. Okay? So they are basically at 80% of the poverty line, the average poor person. And what we can see here on the left scale is the poverty ratio, the poverty rate, according to the OECD. So again, what is the OECD? I mean, this is from a while ago, from 2012. I don't have at the top of my head what the actual poverty threshold was back then. It's probably something like 2/3 of median income. That's a typical poverty threshold for the OECD. And you can see here that in Ireland, it was around 9 or 10% of people who were below, households whose income was below that threshold. What those indices are useful for, it depends what you want to do with them, right? Or what question you want to answer. So the poverty gap, as much as you may say, oh, this sounds strange and what do we do with it, can actually be quite useful because it tells us how much income do we have to redistribute to get everyone to the poverty line. Well, if we say as the government, we agree that the poverty line is at 60% of median income, that's the minimum anyone needs to have a decent life in Ireland. And then let's measure for everyone who's below that, well, just how far below are they? And then how much do we need to redistribute to get everyone to that threshold? And so for this type of thought process, for these type of political goals, measuring the poverty gap is actually very, very useful. Whereas then, if you remember in a previous video, I showed you the long run trends in poverty rates, you would not be able to do any meaningful comparison over a long time when it comes to the poverty gap, because you have changes in the threshold, you have changes in the benchmark income. It would be very, very messy. You could not do this over a decade, let alone a century. And so each of those measures has its purpose, but the purpose can be very different depending on what you use it for.